Have you ever thought about how much power sits inside a single gentle word spoken at home? How a small act of kindness to someone you see every single day might carry more weight with heaven than 1,000 grand gestures made in public? And what would happen if you discovered that the mercy you showed to the difficult person sleeping in the room next to yours actually changed the course of their eternal soul? Throughout the 1500s, across the cold stone corridors of Spanish convents, one woman saw this truth with perfect clarity. She understood that holiness was not about visions or levitations or dramatic penances performed where everyone could see. It was about the quiet choice to love the person right in front of you, especially when that person was sick, broken, or unlovable. Behind the famous mystical experiences and the reform movement that shook the Catholic Church, behind the 17 convents she founded across Spain and the books that made her a doctor of the Church, there lived a woman who believed that the small mercies shown at home mattered more than anything else. Her father, Don Alfonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a wealthy wool merchant. Her mother, Dona Beatriz d'Ávila y Ahumada, died when Teresa was only 14 years old. That loss carved a wound into her that never fully closed. She stood before an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary and begged through tears that Mary would become her mother. That prayer marked the beginning of everything. But before any of that mattered, before the convents and the reforms and the writings, Teresa had to learn what mercy looked like in the smallest, most unglamorous moments of daily life. The Spanish Inquisition was in full force. But the shadow of that forced conversion hung over the family. Before she was 7, Teresa would give alms and say her prayers, especially the Rosary. She and her brother Rodrigo read lives of saints together. When they read about martyrdom, it struck her that this was a very small price to pay for the vision of God. In her autobiography, Teresa tells this story with affection for her younger self. But the adult Teresa was clear. Real courage meant staying where you were planted and loving the people God put in your path. She went before an image of the Blessed Lady and besought her with tears to become her mother. His words convinced her that salvation lay in forsaking marriage and worldly pleasures. But when she told her father she wanted to become a nun, he refused consent. He loved her too much to let her go. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from EWTN's comprehensive biographical documentation on Teresa of Ávila, compiled from her own autobiography and the Book of Foundations, as well as detailed historical records from the Carmelite Order archives held at the University of Notre Dame. These sources include Teresa's personal letters and eyewitness testimonies from the nuns who lived with her daily. Now back to the information. But she went anyway because she believed it was safer than the world outside. Safer for someone who felt as prone to sin as she did. They arranged parties that included young men. Prestige depended not on piety, but on money. The spiritual life consisted of hysteria, weeping, exaggerated penances, nosebleeds, and self-induced visions. Nobody was watching over anyone's soul with real care. But she got more involved in flattery, vanity, and gossip than spiritual guidance. She knew it was wrong. She felt it pulling her away from God. But she could not stop. It made people turn away. Within 2 years, Teresa was struck down with a disease so severe that everyone thought she was dying. Some said it was malaria. Others could not diagnose it at all. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. Pains shot through her body so sharp they stole her consciousness. The disease came with seizures that left her rigid and unresponsive. In August of 1537, her sickness became so violent that she remained insensible for nearly 4 days. She was paralyzed. For 3 years, she could not move. They brought her home to Avila in a state worse than that in which she had left. But God gave her patience. She bore all her sufferings without a murmur, remembering the history of Job and his resignation to the will of God. She spent long hours in silence, trying to keep Jesus Christ present within her mind, even when her body was a prison of pain. This forced stillness became the foundation for everything that followed. She could not run anywhere. She could not perform dramatic acts of service. All she could do was lie there and learn to love God in the darkness when no one was watching and nothing felt sacred. When she could finally move again, she returned to the convent. But the experience had changed nothing about her spiritual life. For the next 15 years, Teresa lived divided between the things of God and the things of the world. She prayed sometimes, she gossiped often, she charmed visitors, she taught mental prayer to guests because it brought money to the convent, but she got more involved in flattery and vanity than spiritual guidance. She avoided real intimacy with Christ because she was afraid of what it would demand from her. She was a lukewarm nun by her own disparaging estimation, neither hot nor cold, neither fully in the world nor fully given to God. He was to her all the comfort and good of her life, and she was his most cherished child. Obedient to his directions, her life became a burden because she learned in prayer more and more her faults. She took delight in the things of God, but she still frequented the parlor. She still tried to reconcile the life of the spirit with that of sense. She felt his presence. She understood with sudden, blinding clarity that love was not a feeling but an action, that mercy was not a grand gesture but a quiet daily choice, that holiness happened at home or it did not happen at all. And she began to practice a new kind of mercy, one that cost her pride and time and comfort, but asked for no recognition in return. She made sure he had a good death, the kind of death that opened the gates of heaven instead of closing them. That mercy, given to her own father in his last hours, became a pattern for everything that followed. He had fathered a daughter out of wedlock. He had no idea what to do. He was drowning in shame and regret. No harsh words, no lecture about sin, just mercy, gentle and clear, pointing him toward the truth without crushing him under its weight. She did not write about it in her books as an example of her charity. She just did it because it was the right thing to do, because mercy meant actually helping people, not just feeling sorry for them or praying for them from a distance. In front of you. It meant choosing gentleness when severity would have been easier. It meant seeing past someone's faults to the soul underneath, the soul that God loved with infinite tenderness. They observed almost complete silence. They wore habits of coarse serge and sandals instead of shoes. They were called discalced Carmelites, shoeless, because of their commitment to radical simplicity. The local nobility objected. The magistrates objected. Teresa's fellow nuns at the Incarnation objected. A lawsuit was filed against her. She was threatened with legal action. Continue her support. One of Teresa's married sisters, Juana, began with her husband Juan de Ovalles to erect a small convent at Ávila in 1561 to shelter the new establishment. Outsiders took it for a house intended for the use of her family, which helped avoid early detection of the true purpose. She explained her vision for a return to the original Carmelite rule, a life of utter withdrawal so the nuns could meditate on divine law and through a prayerful life of penance exercise what she termed our vocation of reparation for the sins of humankind. The Pope granted his approval. With endowments. The number was deliberate. She was convinced that too many women under one roof made for relaxation of discipline. A smaller community meant everyone knew everyone. Everyone's struggles were visible. Everyone's growth could be nurtured. They managed the house. And in all religious observances, whether at spinning or at prayer, Teresa herself was always first and most diligent. She led by example. And most diligent. She led by example, not by force. And when her sisters struggled, when they failed, when they fell into discouragement or doubt, Teresa met them with mercy. She told them to take care of their bodies as well as their souls, to eat when they were hungry, to rest when they were tired, to not turn prayer into a brutal endurance test that left them sick and useless. Most spiritual directors of her time pushed their followers toward extreme penances and bodily mortification. Teresa pushed her sisters toward balance, toward wisdom, toward a mercy that included caring for their own flesh and blood so they could actually serve God instead of collapsing under impossible burdens. Opportunity if we desire it. She taught her sisters that even when sickness limited their time alone, it was no barrier to intimacy with God. Patience meant patience with yourself, especially with the limitations of your suffering body, and a commitment to serve God within those limits instead of destroying yourself trying to transcend them. Recent medical analysis of her remains in Alba de Tormes revealed severe kyphosis, rheumatism, plantar fasciitis, and a fragile physical constitution that caused her to walk with a pronounced stoop in her final years. Every step hurt, every journey was agony, but she kept moving because the work mattered more than the pain. When a prioress practiced excessive austerity and made herself unfit for her duties, Teresa corrected her. When a sister was sick, Teresa made sure she received care. When a sister was discouraged, Teresa sat with her and reminded her that God's love was not earned by suffering but given freely to those who opened their hearts to receive it. Convent where she had spent her early years as a nun, the convent that had opposed her reforms with bitterness and jealousy. The nuns there did not want her. When they heard she was coming, some of them fell into hysterics. They refused to obey her. They saw her as a threat, a fanatic who would force them into a life they did not want. She told them she came not to coerce or instruct, but to serve and to learn from the least among them. By gentleness and tact, she won the affection of the community. She established discipline not through punishment, but through love. She forbade the constant stream of visitors that had distracted the nuns from prayer. She set the finances of the house in order. She created an environment where a more truly religious spirit could reign, where mercy flowed not from weakness, but from strength, rooted in genuine love for God and neighbor. Her needs. A wall collapsed. It fell on the boy and crushed him. When his parents returned, they found Gonzalo lying on the floor with his eyes closed, apparently dead. He looked up at his aunt and giggled. He lifted his small hand and stroked her cheek. Teresa sighed with relief and handed the living child back to his mother. Day in the small moments no one else saw, The moments when a sister needed comfort or correction, when a visitor needed guidance or a gentle word, when someone difficult or unlovable stood in front of her asking for help. She realized immediately that he could initiate the Carmelite reform for men. In November 1568, John opened the first monastery of the primitive rule at Duruelo with Anthony of Jesus. Then came a 3-year pause when Teresa was ordered by her superiors to return to the convent of the Incarnation in Ávila as prioress to revive the flagging religious spirit there. Her period of office finished in 1574, and she was once more on the road. Seville in 1575, and Caravaca de la Cruz in Murcia in 1576. The last house founded by Teresa was that of Burgos in April of 1582. She founded 17 convents for women in total and helped establish 15 monasteries for men. She left a record of the arduous project in her Book of the Foundations, written during these years as a practical guide for future prioresses. She entered towns secretly in the middle of the night to avoid riots from people who opposed her reforms. Mitigated rule: the Chalced Carmelites. The conflict was bitter and dangerous. Although Teresa had foreseen the trouble and tried to prevent it, her attempts failed. The Carmelite general, to whom she had been misrepresented, ordered her to retire to a convent in Castile and cease founding additional convents. John of the Cross was imprisoned at Toledo in 1577. The papal nuncio called her a restless, disobedient gadabout who has gone about teaching as though she were a professor. When her former convent voted her in as prioress, the leader of the Carmelite order excommunicated the nuns. A vicar general stationed an officer of the law outside the door to keep her out. Other religious orders opposed her wherever she went. A princess ordered Teresa to found a convent and then showed up at the door with luggage and maids expecting to be waited on. When Teresa refused to order her nuns to wait on the princess on their knees, the princess denounced her to the Inquisition. They had no money, no food, no protection from the elements. Teresa looked at the situation and said what she always said: God would provide. And she kept working. She said it with affection, not bitterness. She understood that suffering was part of the deal, that God allowed it to shape her into someone capable of real love, not sentimental feeling, but the kind of love that acts, that serves, that gives without counting the cost. She believed God had a good sense of humor and that laughter was a gift, that mercy included making space for joy even in the midst of difficulty, that holiness did not require a long face or a perpetual frown. The autobiography was completed toward the end of her life under obedience to her confessors. She wrote it not for fun, but because she was ordered to. Many people questioned her experiences, and this book would clear her or condemn her. She used a lot of camouflage in the book, following profound thoughts with statements like, "But what do I know? I'm just a wretched woman." The Inquisition liked what they read and cleared her. The Way of Perfection was written in 1566 for her nuns at St. Joseph's. Teresa called this a living book. In it, she set out to teach her nuns how to progress through prayer and Christian meditation. She discussed the rationale for being a Carmelite and dealt with the purpose of and approaches to spiritual life. The title was inspired by the devotional book The Imitation of Christ, which had become a favorite of Teresa long before. She wrote her own work. Unlike other mystics who assumed readers were already well seasoned in contemplative practice, Teresa started at the beginning, even before the beginning, before you knew you had a soul. Her epistolary writing reveals how she used her political acumen to dodge inquisitors and negotiate the thorny issues of the reform. She faced off against authorities, albeit with considerable tact, and reprimanded priests and nuns who failed to follow her orders. She manipulated language, varying her tone and rhetoric according to the recipient, or slipping into deliberate vagueness in order to avoid divulging secrets. What emerged from her correspondence was a portrait of extraordinary courage, ability, and shrewdness. She said mental prayer was nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends, taking time frequently to be alone with Him who we know loves us. The important thing was not to think much, but to love much, and so do that which best stirs you to love. And the way you pleased God was by loving the people He put in your life, especially the ones who were hard to love, the ones who tested your patience, the ones who demanded more than you felt capable of giving. Struggles of ordinary people. She insisted on poverty, not as a punishment, but as a way of staying connected to those who had nothing, of remembering that God's love did not depend on wealth or status or comfort. She wanted the sisters to know that the true prioress of the convent was Mary, not Teresa. This was not false humility. It was a genuine recognition that all authority came from God, that leadership meant service, that the highest position was the position of greatest love and therefore greatest mercy. They had made her life difficult in countless small ways. But Teresa did not hold grudges. She did not punish them. She served them. She showed them mercy day after day after day until their hearts began to soften, until they began to see that what she offered was not chains but freedom, not condemnation but love. The nuns who had refused to obey her now begged her to stay. The religious spirit that had been dead for decades was alive again, and it happened not through force or fear, but through mercy, through Teresa's patient, gentle, daily choice to love even those who hated her, to serve even those who rejected her, to give even when she received nothing in return. In 1580, Pope Gregory XV recognized the Reformed convents and monasteries as a separate province. The Discalced Carmelites were officially established. Teresa was finally freed from the constant opposition and political battles that had marked her work for nearly 20 years. But she did not rest. She continued founding convents, continued writing, continued pouring herself out in service to God and the Church until there was nothing left to give. 3 days later, she said to Anne, "At last, my daughter, I have reached the house of death." She received extreme unction from Father Antony de Heredia. When he asked her where she wished to be buried, she replied, "Will they deny me a little ground for my body here?" She received the sacrament and exclaimed, "Oh, my Lord, now is the time that we shall see each other." She died in Anne's arms during the evening of October 4th, 1582. 9 months after her death, her coffin was opened. Her body was found intact, though the clothing had rotted. Before the body was reinterred, one of her hands was cut off, wrapped in a scarf and sent to Ávila. The body was exhumed again on November 25th, 1585, to be moved to Ávila and found to be incorrupt. An arm was removed and left in Alba de Tormes at the nun's request. The removal was done without the approval of the Duke of Alba de Tormes, and he brought the body back in 1586. Pope Sixtus V ordered that it remain in Alba de Tormes on pain of excommunication. In 1970, Pope St. Paul VI proclaimed Teresa as one of the first 2 women doctors of the Church, along with 14th century Dominican St. Catherine of Siena. The point was, the nephew's illegitimate daughter who received a home and a future when the world would have thrown her out. The point was the letter to the wayward young man that offered grace instead of condemnation. The point was the daily choice to love the sister sleeping in the room next door, the sister who annoyed you, the sister who challenged you, the sister who needed you even when she could not say it out loud. Teresa understood something that most people never learn. The grand gestures do not matter if the small mercies are missing. You can have visions of Christ and still fail to love the person right in front of you. You can reform entire religious orders and still miss the chance to show gentleness to someone who is suffering. You can write books that change the world and still forget that holiness happens at home where it does not happen at all. The power of one gentle act of mercy at home is this: it changes you. It shapes your soul into something capable of receiving God's love and giving it back. It teaches you that love is not a feeling but a decision, not a dramatic moment, but 1,000 small choices made in obscurity and silence. It shows you that the person you think is unlovable is actually the person God has placed in your path to teach you what mercy really means. Teresa saw this with perfect clarity. She practiced it every day for 50 years. She died with nothing, asking only for a little ground for her body, because she had already given everything else away in acts of mercy so small and ordinary that no one kept count of them except God. The examination of her remains in Alba de Tormes showed severe kyphosis that caused her to walk with a pronounced stoop, rheumatism throughout her body, and plantar fasciitis that made every step agonizing. The doctors concluded that Teresa had a very fragile physical constitution and that the injuries must have caused her immense pain when walking. She reformed an entire religious order, and she did it all while her body was breaking down, while every step hurt, while she had to choose mercy over and over again, not from a place of strength, but from a place of profound physical weakness that made every act of love cost something real. It is about choosing love when love is hard, choosing gentleness when severity would be easier, choosing to serve the person right in front of you, even when your body screams for rest and your soul longs for escape. She learned mercy young, and she practiced it until her final breath. That is why her body did not decay. That is why her reforms lasted. That is why her books are still read 500 years later. Not because of the visions or the levitations or the mystical experiences, but because she understood that the gentle act of mercy shown at home in the darkness where no one is watching is the thing that changes everything.